Okay, here's our free GRE prep hour for December 5th, 2023. We are talking about verbal timing for the new version of the GRE that just started in September, shorter version. And want to make sure we have our approach in place, and then we'll do some mixed practice with timing and review to get used to how best to study. So I want to make sure you're on a solid footing about how your approach is going to be for test day, but also that you're getting really good practice between now and then. I think some people only think about timing, only practice timing um, when they take practice tests, and they don't think about it on a daily basis. And I think that gets in the way. Then they get very stressed and they fall behind on the test. And you don't want to accept that you have to fall behind on this test. Anyone can finish on time, anyone. You just have to let some things go, and that's part of the nature of this test. And the beautiful thing with this test is that you can always cycle back. If there's something that you didn't have time for and you're left with time at the end, you can go fix it. But you can't do the opposite. If you already spent a whole lot of time on something, you can't go back and unspend that time. So when in doubt, keep moving and go to the next thing, and then fill in blanks, or not blanks, but fill in trouble spots later on in the test if you have the time. Okay, so I want to make sure we're feeling good about our approach for this. We'll also be doing some practice problems today. All the practice problems that you see will be from our 5-pound book of GRE practice problems, which you can buy and which comes with our course. But we're going to be using those today. They're not official GRE problems, but hopefully you'll find that they're pretty good ones. So as some of you may know, the GRE used to be longer. I mostly keep saying this because if someone were watching this video later, they'd want to know that this isn't the old GRE that I'm talking about. This is the one that we're currently studying for. The GRE used to be longer, so it's gotten quite a bit shorter, which is mostly a good thing. It's just a little bit of pressure on you to not have a whole lot of careless errors, because if you do, those add up very fast when the sections are short. So this is a little bit of a small screenshot from the official ETS website, but basically you can see the structure. You're going to start with a half-hour writing section, essay, and then you'll have 2 verbal sections, which in total are, 41 minutes, and 2 quant sections, which in total are 47 minutes. I have a separate video all about timing for the quant section, where I give you recommendations there. So today I'm just focusing on the verbal section. If you want to look at that other video, you can see my recommendations there. So the verbal section in particular, well, 2 things to know. One, you may know that the GRE is an adaptive test, and it adapts differently than other tests such as the GMAT. The GMAT adapts on a question-by-question basis. The GRE adapts on a section-by-section basis. So what that means is your first section has a mix of difficulties from fairly easy to fairly hard. And depending on how you do on that section, it doesn't really matter which ones you get right, whether you miss the easy ones, whether you miss the hard ones, just depending on how many you get right in that section. You will get routed into a harder, a medium, or an easier second section. And so the second section is of adaptive difficulty. If you're doing very well, that means that your second section will be harder than before, and you'll be under more time pressure than before, because you don't really get more time when the section gets harder. And so if the first section you don't have timing trouble, then maybe on the second one you will. But this can go the other way if you're not doing that great on a section. And some people don't need to max out this test. Maybe you will find that you have maybe you're doing well in verbal but not so well in quant, and on quant you miss enough in the first section that you get an easier second section, and the timing is a little nicer for you. So this can vary. But for those who are shooting for a fairly high score, you want to get used to that additional pressure in the second section. The sections break down this way from what we're seeing on the practice test. The GRE has not officially said this, they will always do it this way, but this is what we're seeing in the practice tests. The first section, the 18-minute section, it's going to have 7 questions that are of the vocab type, text completion and sentence equivalence, and 5 questions of the reading comp type, making a total of 12. The vocab questions, text completions, and sentence equivalents are meant to take about a minute. What I've done here, just to give you rough ideas, is I've made it out up to exactly 18 minutes. And you might not want to do this. You might want to plan to finish a little early. But this is if you were going to use all of the time. The sorry, what I was saying, the reading comp questions, those are meant to take about 2 minutes each on average. Now that includes your reading time. Now, as you may have seen, some of the reading comp questions are just a short argument, and it's just one blurb, one paragraph, and you're addressing that argument. That's what we'd call critical reasoning on the GMAT, but on the GRE, it's just mixed in with the rest of reading comprehension. Other passages will be longer. They could be 2-3 paragraphs and have more detailed information. From my understanding, we're not seeing long passages these days, like the 5-paragraph kind of things, and so you probably won't miss those. But we do have to think about that in our time allocation. So if you have 3 questions to do in 6 minutes, and it turns out it's a passage with 3 questions, you might need a few minutes to read it, but you can't use up all your time reading it. And so you have to think about how to balance that. You can try to gain time by reading faster or skimming, but you may end up losing that time on the back end if you didn't understand the passage adequately. So you have to find your own pace with this. It might depend on the passage and the type of content, but some people go a little slower on the passage and are able to go a little faster on the questions. Some people save time on the passage, even though they might slow down a bit on the questions. You have to find what works for you. The second section is closer to 50-50. So you've got 7 text completions and 8 reading comp, but you still have a pretty tough time allocation there, right? And so you can see you've gained 3 questions, you've gained 5 minutes. But a lot of that, the questions you've picked up are in reading comp, and so the timing is actually pretty tight. So the way I reflected that here is I only allocated a minute each for your text completions instead of a minute 20. So you're kind of losing around a minute-ish there. But again, these are just the reason I put question marks on these is it's not a written law. I can't tell you exactly how long to spend on each part. It might really vary. For instance, if you've seen the text completions, you might know that some of them will have 3 blanks in them. And the thing with those is I don't want to say 3 times the work, but they're more work. And your chances of getting them right on average are lower because you have to get all 3 blanks right to get a point. It's all or nothing. You can't get partial credit. And so some people, especially if they don't love verbal, they just guess on those. Especially if they look at the words and say, oh, I don't know those words, just guess. And so it might really vary. You might find that you routinely guess on a few questions, and therefore you're able to slow down on the others. So these are averages, and these are rough allocations. But you might think about trying something like this where you say, okay, I have 18 minutes at the start of the test, and I can see, I don't get to have a watch or anything, but I can see the time on the screen. So I could say, okay, at the end of the first 3 questions, I should have 14 minutes remaining. And at the end of the next 2 reading comp, I should have 10 minutes remaining, and then 6, right? Like this. But again, that's assuming that you're using all the time down to the wire. You just have to make sure that if you're doing that, you're really sticking to the plan and you're actually actively guessing on something to stay on track of that as needed. Some people might like to make a slightly more aggressive plan. Maybe you only allocate, say, 1 minute and 40 per reading comp. And so you have a couple of minutes at the end that you're planning for as a padding in case you fall slightly behind, or so that you can go back and maybe fill in one question as needed. But be aggressive about staying on time. That's really the number one thing I can say about timing. Be aggressive about it. That doesn't mean hurry. That doesn't mean frantically guess and oh, I don't know, B, right? Instead, it's how could I be efficient and fast? I often think about that as in terms of like emergency responders. If you're a paramedic or a doctor or something like that, you're doing something that requires quite a bit of precision. But there's also a very great degree of time pressure, and you have to balance those things. The difference is, if I'm a paramedic or a doctor, I don't want to ignore anybody. I don't want to say, oh, this person, I don't have time to help them, so, they just have to suffer. I'd rather not do that. On the GRE, I might rather not do that, but I really have to do it. I have to make decisions. And it's very unlikely on the GRE that I'm going to, or that most people are going to do all of these questions correctly or need to. And so, keep in mind that you're trying to get an overall performance. You're not worried about whether you get number 7 right. That's just not the issue. So be ready to burn number 7 or whichever else number you want. Also keep in mind that you don't get extra credit for getting harder questions right. Within a section, if it's a harder section, you get more credit overall. And if it's an easier section, you get less credit overall. But it's only based on the number that you get correct. So within a section, if there's a super easy question that you can do in 30 seconds and a really hard question that takes you 3 minutes, even if you get that hard one right, it's just worth the same as the easy. It's worth a point out of that section. And so it's very important that you don't overinvest in the harder questions, which is exactly what most people do. They spend 4 or 5 minutes on the hardest questions in the section, and then they don't have time to do the other things, and you just really, really, really don't want to do that. So if you've had that experience once, great, have it once and never have it again. Just don't allow it. Just get really used to that. Know the time requirements and stick to them. Okay. Yes, and I can share the recording link for the quant lesson. Questions about this stuff? Okay. So kind of moving over in theme then from the general timing of the test to how do we practice on a daily basis for this. So in my quant lesson, I talked about a similar set of ideas here of creating time sets. You want to choose a length. People have a tendency to go for really long sets, and I don't think you need to do that. First off, the GRE isn't that long these days, right? As you see, you know, the individual sets are you know in the low tens, right? You know, 12, 15 questions, things like that. And that's a full test. And you have tests available to take if you're practicing one way or the other, the official GRE ones or ours or any other provider you're working with. So you don't need to do sets of 10, 20 questions at a time. Often I recommend fairly small sets, 3 questions, 5 questions, maybe 8 questions. Because it's much more important that you're reviewing and getting something out of it. But this depends on your purpose. If your purpose is to work on endurance, every now and then you might do a longer set. If you're trying to do a lot of review of things you've seen before, you might do a somewhat longer set than if you're trying to target a specific thing, right? If I'm trying to get much better at, say, you know, circle problems, maybe I'll go into the 5-pound book of practice problems and find, you know, 3 to 5 circle problems and just do those in a quick time set. If I'm trying to go back through things I've flagged from earlier, I might do a slightly longer set and put those all together because I'm trying to remember what I've done before. I could also be thinking about, am I trying to get better at a specific thing, like I said, like circles, like percents, or am I trying to make sure I recognize different strategies that I might use and choose a good one? So think about what your goal is in making this set. Allocate an amount of time for it. So on average, I would allocate a minute for vocab and 2 minutes for reading comp, assuming that you're taking the test under standard timing. If you have a reading comp passage with several questions, then you would just multiply. Okay, I've got 3 questions. I'm going to give myself 6 minutes to read and do all 3 of those questions. If you know you're working on something very specific, like maybe you're trying to work on the harder 3 blank text depletions, then maybe you'll give yourself a set of those and you'll give yourself a little bit more time. Maybe you give yourself minute and 20, minute and 30 per question on those, or whatever you want to do. Just make sure that it's serving you what you're doing and you're doing it with purpose. And make sure you're always looking for ways to apply a strategy and not just worry about, did you get it right? And make sure you're also thinking about when to move on. How do I know when a question is too hard? How do I know when I've gotten everything I can on a question? And then the idea is that you'd review really thoroughly. And I'm a big advocate of blind review. And the idea of blind review is simply that you don't yet know the answer when you review. So what most people do is they do a set of problems and then they go in and say, okay, I got, you know, everything right except number 7 and number 10. So let me go over those explanations. I don't think that's a very effective way to study. You're going to get much more out of your work if you study everything you do. And the best way to do that is to not even tell yourself what the answer is, because that way you're kind of open and you're receptive. You're trying to figure out what you know and what you don't and how you prove it. So thinking about a vocab question, you might be saying, all right, I know it's not this word, but I was down to these 2 words, and how did I decide, and how sure am I, and how can I tell, and is there a clue? Maybe I was just back and forth between 2 words, but one of them really has to be right and the other has to be wrong. So what is that difference? On a reading comp, maybe I'm trying to figure out what I can infer, or what you know what particular answer might strengthen a particular argument. Well, what is it exactly I'm looking for? What do I know? What did the author give me? What am I looking for? Make that very something you have a real sense of purpose and clarity about when you're reviewing. So some general ideas: match your focus of review to the intention you had. So if you were trying to review circles, then make sure you're saying, okay, did I remember the necessary rules? Did I apply them correctly? Things like that. If you're trying to recognize opportunities to use different strategies, then you do that. So I've been talking about circles, but you know, today's focus in verbal is verbal. So you might be saying, hey, I was really trying to focus on working around unknown vocabulary, and I did a workshop on that too. You can say, how did I deal with the words I didn't know? Or I was really trying to focus on making pairs and sentence equivalents and noticing which of the answers paired together, which is a strategy you may have learned. Maybe I was trying to get better at predicting, right? So I was looking for my that part of the process in particular. And I would always ask these kind of questions. Did I know what the question wanted? How well did I predict? To what extent was the answer predictable, and how could I have done it better? One thing we have to watch out is don't assume it's just some very specific thing. Like for instance, in text completion and sentence equivalence, people tend to assume that when they miss a question, it's because they needed to know the words, because they see there are some words there they don't know. But you might ask yourself, did I actually need to know that word to get this right? Is there a way I could have known that that unknown word had to be the answer because I knew the other ones were wrong? Or if one of the other ones is right, is there a way I should have known that word I did know was right, and then who cares what the unknown word means? So I would say vocabulary is often less than half of the issue, even on the vocab-based questions. And so make sure you're looking at that. Another really helpful thing is to sort of use hindsight and say, okay, now I've gone through this problem timed, and now I've done it again in an untimed review. Maybe at this point I've even checked the answer, right? Now I understand this much better. I understand what's going on in the argument or in the passage or in the sentence. I know what I was supposed to look for, and I know how I found it. So then I might say, how could I have seen more of this up front? Maybe I did well. Maybe I saw most of it, but is there anything that I missed? Or if I had trouble the first time, what is it that I didn't see that I really wish I had seen? And what kind of habits would I have in place? And I think that's really important because if I just focus on, oh, I got it wrong, I chose this and I should have chosen that, well, there's no way to fix that for next time. I can just say, oh, well, next time, don't make a mistake, get it right. It's not very helpful. So instead, I want to look back and say, what kind of habits or processes could I have? A really common one I've talked about is the idea of prediction. If I'm too quick to look at the answers, I often get prejudiced by them. So maybe I need to hold back on the answers. Maybe I need to think about very specific things like how often do I grab a word just because it's more familiar, even though I know it's kind of wrong? Like, am I more likely to choose a familiar word that I don't feel good about than an unfamiliar word that I know nothing about? And I might need to be careful about that. Or I might be going the other way. I might be too quick to choose unfamiliar words when I know there's a word that works. And so why does that happen, and what do I need to watch for? A lot of what you want to think about when you're going through problems. So at least something we'll try to model a bit of in the process today. I'm not going to give you a long time set, partly just because of the nature of this. We're sharing this in Zoom, and then this is going to go on YouTube, and so having a whole set of problems at once isn't super practical. But you have all the time in the world to do that at your own pace, whether you're working with our 5-pound book or the GRE official guide, which everyone should have. But I want to just model some bits of that timing and review process, and including just getting used to feeling that discomfort of the timer, just tick 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 tick. A lot of my students say they're very stressed out by that, to the point of sometimes it really robs their concentration. Especially I hear about this at the beginning and the ends of sections. At the beginning, some people say, "Hey, it takes me several questions just to warm up." And I don't want that. I don't want to have to use the actual GRE to warm up. So I want to think about what I need to do so that I can just hit the ground running when I do the test, and that I'm not kind of freaked out. On the other hand, some people say they're made very nervous by the countdown at the end. Maybe for those last few questions, I'm having hard time focusing because I know that the time is about to run out, and I'm so nervous about that I can't read. So I think it's important to acknowledge that those feelings pop up, and that if you're thinking that, you're not at all alone. In fact, you may be in the majority, right? I have some of it myself. Even though I'm experienced with taking the test and I know that I'm likely to do well, there's still that feeling of, okay, but maybe this time I'll mess up, or maybe I won't be able to get one that I should have gotten. So I have to kind of silence those voices a little bit, but I also need a plan. I need a strategy. One really quick thing is at the end of the section on your very last question, answer it and then do it, if that makes sense. So click an answer, and then work, and then your answer will probably change. Okay, change your answer, but have something filled in so that at least you finished the test one way or the other, and now you're just perfecting. And that's how the whole test works. When you say guess B on number 4, you're not saying, oh, that's my answer for all time. You're saying that's my best guess right now. Maybe it's a random guess, but if I have time to fix it, and if that's where I can get the most benefit from going back, then I will go back at the end of the section. Okay. So those are the kind of questions I'd ask, but let's try some time practice. So for this pair, I will give you 2 minutes. These are 2 blank questions. So some people find that they might want, slightly more than a minute per question on a 2 blank, but it does need to average out to this. So I'm just going to give you 2 minutes. Do the best you can. Aim to have answers written down or committed in your head before we start discussing 2 minutes from now, even if they have to be guesses, even if you just have to say, I don't know that one. That's a really good habit to get into, so you get comfortable with committing and with letting go of questions, even when you feel like with a little more time you could get them right. Okay, so let's take 2 minutes and we'll discuss. Here we go. All right, so there's 2 minutes. So make sure that you've committed yourself on paper or in your head to answers for each blank. Let's talk about this. Now, anytime we review a question where we've already seen the answers, right, which is the norm, of course, there's a temptation to justify our thoughts in terms of the answers that we eventually got or the answer choices that we saw. But you want to remember how the process really goes. Normally, we're trying to understand what the sentence says without having read the answers, and that's really how you want to do it. And in other workshops, I've really focused on, hey, I'm not even going to show you the answers before we talk about the process. Since today's focus is primarily on timing, I want to let you have the timed experience. But when you're doing these, initially, it really, I think, is important to think about what we know about what goes in the word without worrying about the blanks. And so if you just tell me, hey, I predicted these exact same words, unless you just, were really, really lucky or had a very specific, reason to choose those, usually you'd say, well, wait a minute, what's going on there? Was I jumping to the answer choices too soon? Okay. So let's look at then that process of prediction. The sentence starts with this phrase, though the negotiation was initially expected to proceed smoothly. And I think it's really important to recognize that at this point, we kind of already know what's going to come next, or we want to. So when I see this, what is going to have to be coming? What does that word though in particular imply about what we should see next? We're going to have to see some kind of contrast, right? We expect a contradiction. And we don't always know what kind of contradiction. For instance, it could be, I could say something like, though I had heard the actor was short, I was still surprised at how much taller I was than him when I met him, right? So it could be that kind of contrast between what I knew and my reaction. So sometimes the kind of surprise we get surprises us. But generally, we can say if we expected initially that a negotiation would proceed smoothly, then it must not have, right? And we see it soon became apparent that any semblance of blank was disingenuous or at best a superficial adherence to blank. So a lot of terminology. You may well know what the word disingenuous means, but let's just pretend we don't, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I have literally no idea what disingenuous means. Okay, I can survive that because when they talk about any semblance of blank, what kind of word, don't worry about the answer choice, but what kind of word is that going to have to be, right? If there's an initial expectation, smooth negotiation, actuality is going to have to be to just repurpose that same kind of thinking of smooth, a rough negotiation, right? Maybe not literally physically rough, right? But not a very nice one, right? And often we see a negotiation between two parties as maybe a bit adversarial, or there's something they might be fighting over. So what kind of word? Give me a word that's not from the blank, not from the answers. What kind of word did you predict, or what kind of word could I predict when I get to this point of the sentence? Probably want something along the lines of agreement. To use a not very fancy word, niceness, right? Because they're saying, hey, any semblance, and semblance is another word that not everyone's comfortable with, but it's like uh, an appearance, right? And so it of course helps if you do know the word. Disingenuous means not honest, fake, not sincere, right? But even if you don't know that, you can say, okay, they thought it would go smoothly, but any semblance, any appearance of something good was this, or at best superficial, right? So they're saying there wasn't really this niceness, this agreement. And so then what kind of word could I go in the second blank? A superficial adherence to certain things. So they're saying we thought they'd be, we thought things would be okay, but any niceness was fake, or it was just them adhering to, and then I might say something like, you know, like general courtesy, right? Like I'm being courteous, but I'm not actually agreeing or being helpful, right? So, maybe a very loose fill in would be courtesy. We'll see a better one in the answer, right? Okay, so questions on how we got those fill-ins. But I think really important to have some and to push for that. And if it's hard for you, all the more reason to practice it, right? On the test, sometimes you may not be able to do it, and then great, go to the answers and see what you have. But you want to make it the default that you're trying to predict. Okay. So then let's look at what the answers give us. So the first word needs to be something like agreement or niceness, something that we would like to have in a negotiation. What can I get rid of? Anything? You may be frantically looking these words up in a dictionary, and that's fine. Usually I like to save that for as late as possible to see, can I get all the way to an answer even without knowing some of the words? And then if I'm really stuck in my review, then I'll go look up the words afterwards, right? Yeah, we can get rid of solace. Solace is a positive word, but solace is not the right kind of word. It's like when you find a place of safety and comfort, it's not really something you'd have between people, right? So I might seek the solace of my grandma's house when I'm having a bad day or something like that. But it's not really an appearance that you'd have between two groups of people. These other words may or may not be, of course, familiar. But duplicity, if you know that it's negative, That would be enough to cross it out. And duplicity is when you're fake or phony, like a duplicate. But it's also kind of like being two-faced, right? You're acting one way and you're actually really feeling or doing something the other way, right? So these are, I'm not obviously giving you formal dictionary definitions. So, if these words aren't familiar, add them to your list. I think some of the best words to study are ones we've seen in context. You can always memorize vocabulary lists, but words you've seen in context or used in real life or heard used in real life stick a little bit better. I can think of, maybe you can too, specific words that I learned ages ago, just because I remember where I was and who said them and kind of like, oh, I've never heard that term before, right? Or that word. Okay, so amity, if you know like the Latin root or like the Spanish amigo, something like that, it's like friendliness. So that makes sense. So if any appearance of friendliness was fake, and they're adhering to certain, like they were not really friends, but they were kind of being polite or civilized or not wanting to make a fuss. A truism is just something you say that's kind of like accepted as true, maybe not a big deal. Applauded is praise, right? That's not what we want. Mores, as you might know, social mores are like what's rules or guidelines about what's acceptable, right? Values. And so it's like, look, these people basically seem to not like each other very much. They were acting friendly, but it was fake. They were just doing it because that's kind of what you do. You're polite in these settings, but that doesn't mean that they're actually getting along or being helpful. Okay, that one all right? And then notice we have the same kind of issue at the beginning of the second one. We have this word notwithstanding. Same kind of thing. When you see notwithstanding this, it means that even though we have this, we're going to see something else, right? So notwithstanding the rain, the game went on, right? And it might sound the opposite. You might say, wait, notwithstanding the rain, if you said those as two words, notwithstanding, you might think, oh, they weren't withstanding the rain. They went home. No. It means, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know why we say it this way. It's a very long-winded way to say it, but we're saying even though there was this, right? So what we know is expectation, right? Initial, setup, you might say, is there's a big mess of tools. And then, the sort of contradiction, there was order, right? Different from my desk where there's a big mess and there's really not order, honestly. I mean, kind of, I can reach my keyboard, but okay. And then what you'll often see if you have a semicolon or a colon after a long sentence or clause like this, you'll see something that's a bit repetitive. And that's important about the GRE because in real life, sentences aren't always repetitive, but the GRE has to be a bit repetitive so that they can have a fair answer, so we can know what the answer is rather than just be guessing, right? If I just had a blank that said, I didn't like the movie because it was blank, I don't know what goes in that blank. So unless there's just one bad thing, there's no way to know what it is. And honestly, in real life, it could even be what seems like a good thing, right? I didn't like that movie because it was, pretty, and I don't like pretty movies. Or okay, who knows, right? But the GRE has to give you a clue. It has to make it clear what kind of thing goes in that blank, and so we need to know. So there's that bit of redundancy. They already have told us that it's messy, but it had order. So now they have this other interesting structure. The decor was if blank, blank. That's a kind of a weird thing because it has two blanks in a row. But one of these is going to say orderly, right? Which one? Blank one or blank two? Think about how we use this construction, right? I might say, we won a victory. It's kind of redundant. You win a victory, if a small one, right? It was, if not the, greatest song on the album, certainly a moving one or something like that, right? And so it's the idea of we're saying, hey, something may be this or maybe not this, but it's definitely this thing that follows. And so the structure is saying the decor was orderly, right? And then we can just, I mean, I really wouldn't put almost any other word in there. I mean, I could say something like neat, right? But since they said there was a sense of order, then orderly is going to be my prediction. And so then if the if thing is what it's sort of overcoming, it's like the notwithstanding. So I would just put in messy. And I really don't need anything else than those words. Those obviously aren't the answers by themselves, but those are the things that I would predict. And those are what the words need to match. Okay. So then looking at the answers, I would just say, hey, do I know which words mean messy and orderly? Um, Sometimes you'll have an interesting split here. Like for instance, you might know that arduous means difficult or hard. That doesn't really apply. It might be arduous to get through the room or something or to clean it, right? But I'm not the cleaning person, so I don't need to worry about that. Um, Dire is like really bad. It could be used to kind of like humorously to describe the state of my desk or something like that. Um, but you'd have to know that that's what they're saying. Oh, oh, does it need cleaning? Oh yeah, it's pretty dire. It's in dire need of cleaning, right? So we don't know that this decor was dire. I don't even know if I can really say decor itself is dire. It's more like a situation is dire. Unkempt literally just means messy, right? People often talk about it in terms of someone's appearance, their wrinkly clothes and their messy hair, but it can certainly be used for a space you live in as well. I know nothing about whether it was sophisticated, right? You can be orderly with or without being sophisticated, right? So I don't know anything about the sophistication of it. Um, Callous is weird. That's like when you don't care about other people's feelings, right? I have calluses on my fingers from playing the guitar, and I can't feel the guitar as much as a normal person because of that. At least it doesn't hurt as much. But if you're callous in your heart, you're not feeling other people's pain, or you don't care that you're harming someone. Not what we want. So then surprisingly deliberate is saying everything seemed to be done on purpose, right? And so that's not what I predicted. Orderly and deliberate don't mean the exact same thing. Aha, right? Things are where they are, you know, intentionally, right? The artist wants them that way. Right? Uh, and maybe it's itself a form of art or design, right? But the idea is okay. So things are messy and there's things everywhere, but things also seem to be where they are wanted. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay. Let's try some timed experiences with some reading comp questions now too. So I'll give you a argument-based reading comp, and then we'll see how much time we have. We might do another short one of an inference type. But let's take a couple minutes to try this. And so again, if you were doing this as a whole set, you might say, okay, I'm going to do two 2-minute reading comp questions and two or four. Oh yeah, I want to try a sentence equivalence. And then two or four vocab questions about a minute each, and allocate time for that and just get used to that whole set of time. So let me give you 2 minutes to try this question, and here we go. Okay, so how did that 2 minutes feel? I'm curious how it compared to the time it took to do two individual shorter questions. Did that go faster, slower? Did this seem like adequate time to handle this question? If you're relatively new to the GRE, it might also have just felt like, I don't know what this question wants from me. And this is definitely a less familiar task. I think we, naturally, if we're, we can read a sentence, we can say, all right, what word goes in the blank? There's strategy there, of course, as we talked about, but it might feel more natural what we're supposed to do. When they ask us to weaken claims, that's something we're often very bad at in real life, because we argue with each other in these very silly ways, right? For instance, we argue with each other based on, uneven like appearance. Well, look at your face, you're probably wrong, this kind of thing, or look at your cheap clothes, and that's not an intelligent way to disagree with someone's position, but we do it sometimes. Um, but we also tend to argue with things that aren't what the person actually said. And that's where the GRE really penalizes us. So even if I'm focused very clearly on disagreeing with the person's logic, I have to make sure I know what their logic is and that I'm not disagreeing with a point they never made. And that's another thing, we get in a lot of trouble for in real life. You make some really careful point and someone listens to you as if you said something totally different and gets mad at you. And you're like, I didn't say anything like that. It's not the point I'm making. And so we have to be very careful about that. So hopefully getting better at this part of the GRE will just make you a better, nicer person, or at least a more effective arguer, even when you're being tough on someone. Okay, so we want to weaken the claims, so we have to know what they are. These are going to be built with a premise and a conclusion, and we have all sorts of materials to go through this in more depth. This is just a quick version. We're going to have a premise, which is something we accept as a fact, and a conclusion, which is something that we are trying to support. So here, farmers are claiming that the U.S. government is responsible for the low price of wheat. Okay, why do they think that? The U.S. government buys the wheat American farmers are unable to sell, so they're sort of subsidizing people's surplus production. So American farmers have no incentive to modulate the size of their crops. I can grow all the wheat I want, and I know that it'll get bought because if no one wants it, oh, the government will buy it. As a result, American farmers routinely produce more wheat than the global market can absorb. So we're producing too much wheat, and the global price of wheat is kept low. Without these subsidies, the farmers in developing economies claim American farmers would produce only the amount of wheat that they could sell in the open market, and the global price of wheat would rise. So this might take a little bit of playing with to absorb, but they're basically saying the U.S. buys surplus from farmers, so the farmers grow too much, and they're saying, all right, uh, you know, uh, that makes wheat prices low. So subsidies are, what stop prices from going up. And that makes a lot of sense. I get it. But I want to weaken the claim. So I want to think about, is there some way that the subsidies do not, you know, uh, are not the problem, or that cutting them would not fix the problem? And that's like two different questions in a sense, right? It would be like if I had a lot of illness because I smoked. First, you might say, is it because of smoking? Right? Like, have we really proven that it's because of smoking, or do we just think it is? And then second, if I stopped smoking, would that fix it? Right? And notice, even if you very much agree that, let's say my cough, or my illness, I maybe have emphysema or something, is caused by smoking. Does that mean that stopping smoking would then cure me? Would it make it better? Would it make any difference at all, or is it too late? Right? So we wouldn't automatically know that. Okay. So looking at these answers then, we we might just try to grab something. I always try to predict. And so if you were able to predict anything, I mean, if you predicted the right answer here, then kudos to you. But if you're able to think of anything that might address it, then great. But let's see how we're doing in answering this one, just in the interest of time. So let me actually have you use a poll if you're able to do that from where you are. Go ahead and enter in your answer in the poll for this. I'm just curious what people got. Okay. So I have a couple different answers. And we want to make sure that what we're thinking about is this relevant? And so a really important thing to always look at on these is don't just think about, did I get it right or did I get it wrong? Or do I understand what the answer is about or why the answer is right? That's great. But also, do I understand what makes the wrong answers wrong really consistently when I run back through? And I think that's something that people don't look at enough. If you can get really good at identifying wrong answers, then sometimes the right answer almost leaps out off the screen at you because it's, oh no, not this, not this, not, and then when you finally see one that's not bad, oh, I see how that makes sense. And then other times the right answer doesn't make any sense at all. But if you've crossed out all the wrong ones, maybe you cross out all 5, you come back and say, well, no, it's definitely not this, and this definitely doesn't matter. So what could it be? Okay. So not everyone got this right, but let's see what we can get out of it. So I'll just kind of run through the answers in order. A says wheat is not processed for consumption is often used for certain industrial applications, right? So it might be getting used, right? Uh, so maybe some of the excess is used, but what does that tell us about subsidies, right? Also, it doesn't say there isn't an excess. It's just like, hey, they're using it, right? Do we need all the coffee grounds that Starbucks disposes of every day? No, we probably don't need all of them. I get why they have them. They made coffee, right? That's fine. And maybe some of us, get the coffee grounds for our compost heap or something like that. But even if we do, we still have a bunch of coffee grounds we don't need. And so if Starbucks could somehow make coffee without producing as many coffee grounds, then great. That sounds like a good plan, right? So we don't need to know that some of the excess gets used. This talks about predicting how much they'll buy in advance. I never would have predicted an answer like this, and I have to be very careful not to get distracted by it. So I'd say, okay, but what does that have to do with the effect of creating a surplus, right? Through the subsidies. So I don't really need to know whether they're predictable or anything like that, because in the end, I think one reason that the B is really irrelevant is they've told us that Americans don't have any incentive to affect the size of their crops, to reduce them according to the needs of the market. So even if they could predict what people are going to buy, right, then they still wouldn't need to do that because they could just sell whatever they make. Also, notice how narrow it be is. It says non-governmental buyers are able to pick, but maybe the government buys wheat beyond just the excess. Maybe the government buys it for a lot of projects, and that's not predictable. So there might still be a surplus no matter what. Okay. C, I think, was a tempting answer for some folks, but we want to cross it out. If you look at what this is saying, it says that there are subsidies to soybean farmers, and the soybean prices are higher than that of wheat, right? So this just says that not all subsidized crops are the same price, but are they lower than they should be, right? Like, think about it this way. What if the government offered subsidies for automobiles and they said, oh, well, automobiles are expensive, right? Even though the government buys all the extra Fords and Chevys that American car producers produce, they still cost, some of them $30,000. So they must not be keeping the price low. But maybe 30,000 is low. Maybe they would normally sell for 35 or 40 if that didn't happen. You can't say, well, a Chevy costs more than a soybean. Who cares, right? So notice that when you talk about just the price and nothing else, you have to say, okay, what effect would it have? Or think about a person, right? What if I said, I'm trying to run in my work shoes and like my fancy dress shoes. But it must not be a problem because Brad runs faster than me and he wears shoes like that too. But maybe it is a problem for me. Maybe Brad's just really, really fast, but he'd be even faster if he had a, good pair of running shoes. And so I can't know just from saying one is higher or faster or more that it's not being held back. Right. And that's an important consideration. D says other countries such as Canada and Russia are likely to produce more wheat if the United States were to reduce its output. right? So why do I care about Canada and Russia? I thought I'm just talking about America. Well, wait a minute. If they would jump in to, you know, fill any drop in our production, then prices will stay low anyway, right? So let's say US cuts production of wheat by 50%. Will prices go up? Normally you would expect that, especially when they've told us that the high supply keeps the prices low. You don't have to assume anything about supply and demand from this or know anything in advance. Um, but if Canada and Russia just came in and produced enough wheat to fill that gap, or even some of that gap, then it would sound like there would still be a lot of wheat production. So that's why D is a weekend, right? And E is a lot like C. So if you one red flag that C is wrong is that E is very similar reasoning, right? Because it's saying, you know, no subsidies, but price still low. It would be like if I said, you know, hey, Chuck over there, he's not wearing running shoes either. Or sorry, he is wearing running shoes, and he still runs really slow. It's like, all right, so that's kind of the same kind of reasoning as C. It's kind of breaking that correlation between a particular price and whether there's a subsidy, but it doesn't tell us whether the price is kept lower than it would have been by the subsidy, and that's what we're trying to figure out. That's like anything. It's like trying to figure out someone's whether studying helped from just looking at someone's GRE score without knowing what they got before or what they would have gotten if they hadn't studied, right? Oh, you know, I got a 160 on quant, so the studying must have helped. Well, where were you before? Did you take a practice test? Is that an improvement? I don't know. Right. Okay. So D is what we want. Okay. That feel all right? Um, So we'll stop there. You know, we didn't do a million problems, but I want to make sure we're just thinking about how we approach our timing on these. And you know, timing is always tricky, even with these sessions. I always plan to do twice the number of questions than we end up having time for. And so we have to think about that. Now, if my goal, however, were just to show you all the questions, then I would have talked much faster and not explained things and just go, 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 go. And that's your goal in the GRE. You don't care about doing a good job on every single question, although of course you would like to. You care about maximizing your overall. So make sure you're thinking about that when you're making your sets, and make sure you're thinking about that when you're reviewing your sets. How am I going through the sets to make sure that I'm achieving, if not mastery, I'm getting more comfortable and fluent with the process of doing these time sets and the process of using my time well. Okay. So I'll end back on the just the general time and recommendation slide. And you might play with this and vary and see, hey, maybe I am fast on reading comp and I can buy a little bit more time for text completion. So maybe I'll move these markers by a minute or two one way or the other. But something like this I think is important to stick to. And try this out on your next practice test, whether that's your first practice test or your seventh. Try it out and see how that's going. Um, and stick around if you have any questions. Also, would love to have you stop by any of our classes. You can always do the first session as a freebie to see if you like what we're offering, so you can see our course listings on the site. But yeah, if you have anything in your mind, let me know. Other than that, best of luck with your studies.